Well, good morning, and in James's case, good evening. There are many people who are registered, and I'm sure there are many people who are here, even though I can only see a very few of you on the screen. It's wonderful that you've gathered from across Australia and also from other parts of the world for this special CRA national webinar. And as you heard from Anne, my name is Peter Carroll. I'm the Provincial Damaris Brothers and also currently the President of Catholic Religious Australia, which is sponsoring this webinar. The webinar, Building Bridges, Reaching Out to Our LGBTQIA+ community. And we're delighted to have Father James Martin, Jesuit priest, well-known writer. In fact, I used your book on the Holy Land as part of the preparation for my Holy Land retreat some year, James. So it's wonderful to meet you in this setting today. We'll hear more about James from Anne as we get underway. But James, we have a tradition in Australia of acknowledging country as we gather. What we mean by that is the inhabitants of this land. You know, for 60,000 years, our Indigenous First Nations people, the Australian Aboriginals, they have had a very close connection to the lands that we dwell on. And so we acknowledge the custodians of that land. So I'll start with our acknowledgement of country. And we're all gathered in Australia on different lands. So you might I'll just pause and you can just say to yourself the land that you are on. We pay respect to and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us gathers. And also pay respect to elders, both past, present, and emerging, for their care of our land. And we pause for a moment of prayer. Gracious God, open our hearts and minds this day that we may hear your voice deeply. Send your Spirit into our midst to bring new understandings. Lead us closer into relationship with Christ, with each other, and to the transformation of our life. And we make our prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. I'd like now to introduce, or to reintroduce, because she was talking as we began, Anne Walker. Anne is the National Executive Director of CRA, and she will be our facilitator for this webinar today. So thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Peter. And welcome all of you, wherever you are, to Building Bridges with James Martin. As I said earlier, it's early for some, 7 a.m. in the West and 7 p.m. for James in New York. So thank you, James, so much for being with us. As many of you would know, Catholic Religious Australia is the national conference of leaders of religious institutes and societies of apostolic life across Australia. Usually we only hold events for our members, but today, because of the significance of the topic, we decided to open up this event more broadly, to take up Pope Francis's call to be inclusive, to be together, to listen, to discern, and no doubt be enriched together. So the topic of today's conversation is church and the people who are LGBTQIA+. It's one which has drawn strong views, both within the church and more broadly, and of course has received particular focus more recently. We are gathered here today because we wish to listen to James' experience, perspective, and wisdom for us. So some information and then to set the scene. So we will be recording the event today. We'd ask you to mute your mic and keep it muted. There are two ways to view the event, gallery and speaker view, so you can choose which works for you. Speaker view will give you a better view of James as he speaks. Questions will be addressed in the Q&A section after James has spoken. So to make comments or send in questions, send them across to Emma at justice@catholicreligious.org.au, which was sent to you in your confirmation email. If you make comments via chat, please be mindful of what you write to ensure respect to our broad audience here today. We will mute or remove people if the engagement is disrespectful or disruptive to the event. So the format for today is that James will speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll have questions for about 15 minutes. So now I'm delighted to introduce James to you, a Jesuit priest, author and editor-at-large at America, the National Catholic Jesuit magazine in America. James has commented on religion and spirituality in the national and international media and has appeared on major radio, television networks in the USA, authoring many books. For his various ministries, James has received Honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degrees from 5 universities and colleges in the USA. James was made a consultor of the Vatican Dicastery of Communication in 2017 and has received a number of significant gestures of endorsement from Pope Francis for his ministry, this particular ministry with LGBTQIA+ people. So we are really delighted, James, that you can join us today, which I suggest is at a critical time in the Australian Church. There has been much discussion during and around the first General Assembly of Australia's Plenary Council about the lack of welcome and inclusion of the LGBTQIA+ community in our church, and whether or not the Plenary Council can and will adequately name and discuss and address these issues. We've also witnessed in the past 12 months the global conversation around the Francesco documentary and what Pope Francis did or did not say, and then the release of the responsum of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith regarding the blessing of the unions of persons of the same sex. So as the Plenary Council calls us to contemplate how the Church in Australia can better meet the needs of the most vulnerable, go to the peripheries, and be missionary in places that may be overlooked or left behind, it is imperative that we consider LGBTQIA+ communities. We know these individuals and communities are at an increased risk of marginalisation, which can result in increased depression and suicide, especially we've seen the figures in youth. Verbal, physical and sexual harassment within Australian society. How might our church practices contribute to this or alleviate this? We have the opportunity to consider more deeply how we respond to the call to honour the dignity of all and how this is lived out in, by and through our church. So with this in mind, I welcome James to discuss with us how we might better minister to these communities. Thank you, James. I hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Anne. And for the record, you can all call me Jim. Jim is fine. I was told that I do not have to wear my collar tonight, which is why I am a little bit more informal than we would normally be in the United States. I'm very happy to be with all of my sisters and brothers religious and very happy to be talking with you tonight about this topic. What I'd like to do in the next half hour or so is to talk about 3 things. 1, my own experience with this ministry. 2, some gospel passages I think that are helpful for us in understanding this ministry. And 3, what Pope Francis has done. I hope I can get through all of them. And if not, the main one is the gospel passages. So very briefly, I won't go through my entire life or formation, but I entered the Jesuits in 1988. And I would say that, like many of you, much of my formation was done, in terms of reaching out to those on the margins. So in addition to the normal, the novitiate and philosophy studies and theology studies, in the novitiate, I worked with people who were sick in a seriously ill in a hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I worked with homeless men and women. I worked for 4 months with Mother Teresa's sisters, the Missionaries of Charity in Kingston, Jamaica. So people who were marginalized and forgotten by many people in society. In my philosophy studies in Loyola University, Chicago, I worked with street gangs, members of street gangs, and also homeless people. And then for 2 years, I worked in East Africa, in Nairobi, Kenya, with the Jesuit Refugee Service, where I helped Refugees from all over East Africa start small businesses. I came back, I did my theology studies, and I worked in a jail in Boston. So I guess what I'm saying is, throughout my formation, I'd really worked with people who felt like they were on the margins. I started at America Magazine after my ordination in 1999, and I really never did any sort of formal ministry with LGBT people. I mean, I wrote about them from time to time. I certainly knew LGBTQ people. By the way, I'm going to say LGBT or LGBTQ. If I forget all the other letters and pluses, please don't think that I'm being exclusionary. But I'd never really done anything formal. That changed in 2016 at the Pulse nightclub massacre in Orlando, Florida, where 49 people were murdered in what was then the largest mass shooting in US history. It has sadly been surpassed. And what surprised me about that, in addition to the terrible tragedy of these poor people dying, was that very few bishops in the United States said anything. Now, I'm not sure what it's like in Australia, but certainly when there's a natural disaster or some shooting, bishops usually say something. They express some condolence, they make some statement, they make a statement of solidarity with the community that had been harmed or some way. There's sometimes public gestures. There was a 2-line statement from the US Bishop Conference that didn't mention the word gay or LGBT. There were only a handful of other people who said anything. And what came into my mind continually was, even in death, these people are invisible to the church. So I did a Facebook video that, as they say, went viral. And that led to an invitation to give a talk at New Ways Ministry, which is a group that advocates for and ministers to LGBTQ Catholics. Now, one thing for all of you religious to know is that I did this all with permission and, asking for permission from my Jesuit superiors. And at each juncture, everything I'm going to tell you was sort of set before my Jesuit superiors, and they gave me permission. So I'm doing all this within the church, never challenging church teaching. So I did this talk, which was called the Building Bridges talk. And then it turned into a book called Building a Bridge, which came out a year after the Pulse nightclub massacre. Many people laugh when I tell them this, but I didn't think it would be very controversial. It is a very small book physically and in terms of its scope. It doesn't challenge church teaching. It basically asks the church to treat LGBTQ people with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, which is what the Catechism says. But shortly after the book was published, the reactions were just incredibly strong, positive and negative. The first few weeks that I was giving talks at different churches, I would have standing room only, standing ovations, packed houses. It was extraordinary, people hugging me and kissing me. And then came the pushback, from people on the right, the far right, demonizing me. I had talks canceled, protests, name calling about me, real personal attacks. And so that was kind of a surprise. I mean, so all of this pointed out the need for a kind of conversation about this. Then came what I would call the pushback to the pushback, which was that archbishops and cardinals and various people invited me to their dioceses. Cardinal Supich of Chicago, now Cardinal Wilton Gregory of Washington, then in Atlanta, invited me to show their support. So you saw this kind of big rift in the church. Then in 2018, the Vatican invited me to give a talk at the World Meeting of Families. And they picked the topic. The topic was showing respect and welcome in our parishes to LGBTQ people and their families. The first time that ever used the word LGBT in a Vatican meeting. So even that was controversial. It was in Dublin, Ireland, first time I ever went there. And because it was seen as controversial, there was an alternate World Meeting of Families that was taking place at the same time. So apparently the Vatican's World Meeting of Families was not sufficiently orthodox for them. So there was a group across the street. I gave that talk and it moved me into this ministry, which I really never thought that I would be doing. I didn't really plan on doing LGBTQ ministry. And I ended up doing a lot of talks and lectures and retreats and things like that. And then in 2019, as you heard, I'm a consultor to the Vatican's Dicastery for Communication, a very low level appointment. And I was over there for their plenary session, and I was invited to an audience with Pope Francis. And we spent a half an hour talking about LGBTQ ministry. And one of the ways that he sort of supports is through these gestures. We'll talk about this later. And one of the gestures was meeting with me. They sent out a picture of the meeting. They put it on his official schedule. And we had a wonderful time. He was very warm and open, and we spent a half an hour talking about this. And one thing I can say now, because he has sent me a letter a couple months ago that I was allowed to share, is that at the end of the meeting, I can say this now, at the end of the meeting, I said, is there anything I can do for you? We were talking for a half an hour about LGBT stuff. And I thought, well, he's the Pope. Maybe he wants to talk about something else. Maybe I should give him the opportunity to ask me something else. And I said, so what can I do for you, Holy Father? And he said, what you can do for me is continue your ministry in peace. So I felt like I had a kind of mission from the Pope. And since then, I've just been doing work with LGBT people and groups like yourselves and schools and, in conjunction with many, many people. So that's my story, basically. I feel like I was led by the Holy Spirit. I didn't set out to do this ministry, but it seemed like at each turn, God was just kind of leading me. Coming up, I'm thinking of starting a website to sort of bring a lot of resources together for LGBTQ Catholics. Okay, now that's my little journey. Why do we do this ministry? Well, in addition to what Anne said, the fact that many LGBT people are people at risk, especially youth, right? Certainly at higher risk of violence and harassment and beatings. As you know, in 69 countries or 70 countries, simply being LGBT or engaging in same-sex relations is illegal. You can be jailed for these things. In 10 countries, you can be executed for same-sex relations or for any sort of LGBT advocacy. In our church, of course, they're treated like lepers. I just was talking today on the phone with a man who was fired from 2 of his jobs in the church, one as a school teacher and one as the parish music minister. Just today, he was in tears. They're targeted like no one else in the church, as if no one else's lives are complex or not fully conforming with church teaching. They're targeted. They feel like lepers. They hear the worst things from pulpits, from pastors. I get messages every single day. But so that's enough of a reason to want to reach out to them, right? But what about a sort of more basic reason? What about our call as religious, who vow ourselves to Jesus in poverty, chastity, and obedience? How would Jesus handle these things? So what I'd most like to do today, this morning, is to look at 3 gospel stories I find very, very helpful. And what can they tell us about the way that Jesus approaches people on the margins? And what I'd like you to do is maybe see them through a different lens. The first one is a story of the Roman Centurion. I don't have to repeat these stories to you. As you know, Jesus is in Capernaum, town of about 1,500 people on the seashore of Galilee, his home base during his ministry in Galilee. And he encounters a Roman centurion. As you know, the Roman centurion comes up to him and asks for healing for his servant. Jesus, depending on the gospel, he says to Jesus, or his servants say to Jesus, you don't have to come to my house, of course. I'm a man with people under my authority, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and do this to another, and he does it, and come to another, and he comes. And Jesus says, never in Israel have I seen faith like this. And the man's servant is healed. And in fact, interestingly, he says, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Notice that the words we say every day in Mass, we don't quote Mary or Joseph, we quote an outsider. We quote an outsider from Capernaum. So what are we to make of this story? Well, I mean, the traditional take on this story, as you know, is Jesus's power over illness, right? Jesus is able to heal with a word. The creativity and the effectiveness of Jesus's word. He doesn't need a magic potion. He doesn't need any sort of magic words. He doesn't need a magic wand or an incantation, just his word. Just the way God, right, creates with a word, let there be light, right? The word affects what it does and what it means. Jesus is able to heal with a word. Okay. But there's another part of this story I think that we sometimes overlook. Excuse me. Look at the way that he treats someone on the margins. The Roman centurion is about as far away from Jewish society as you could imagine. Now, we are told in one gospel that, some of the people say, be nice to him because he built our synagogue for us. And by the way, if you go to Capernaum, the ruins of that actual synagogue are there. They're still there. The first century synagogue paid for by the centurion. Nonetheless, he is outside of Jewish society. He is completely on the margins. There are probably some Jews who hate him because he's a centurion. He is not monotheistic. He does not believe in God. He does not believe in God the Father. Jesus is God, right? He probably carries around little Roman household gods. He believes in multiple Roman gods, if he believes in any gods at all. How does Jesus treat this person who is not part of the religious milieu, who does not believe in the same things? Does he call him a sinner? Does he say, go away from me? You're not Jewish. I'm not going to talk to you. Does he say, come back when you're Jewish? Go and convert, get circumcised and come back and I will talk to you? Does he insult him? Does he single him out as a terrible person? No. He treats him with, as the Catechism says, respect, compassion, and sensitivity. He listens to him. He encounters him, that great line of Pope Francis's Culture of Encounter, and he praises his faith to the amazement of everyone. Now, interestingly, when I think of LGBTQ people in our church, you think of all the things they have to put up with. The pastors and priests who say terrible things to them, other church leaders who single them out, people who are fired, people are just really treated like dirt, as if they are the only people in the church, whose lives are complex or outside church teaching. They don't, bishops and priests don't talk about young people like that, college age student or university age students, many of whom are sexually active. They don't call them all sinners, right? They don't talk about divorced and remarried people like that. They don't talk about business people like that. Only the LGBT person is singled out like that. Okay. And sometimes when I talk to these people, like this young man today, who was fired from his 2 jobs and who is still Catholic and who still wants to work in the church, I think what Jesus said about the Roman centurion, never have I seen faith like this perseverance. But what I'm saying is that look at the way he treats this person on the margins. And then he does a great favor for him. He heals the man's servant. So that's the first story that gives us an early indication of the way that Jesus treats people on the margins and who feel like they're on the margins and who are outside, the religious practices of the Jewish people of the time. The second story is the story of the Samaritan woman, or the woman at the well, that we all love so well, no pun intended. So Jesus is going through Samaria. He comes upon the well, and it's at 12 o'clock. Why does John's gospel mention that? Well, why would a woman be at a well in the heat of the day? I mean, in Australia, I'm sure you know this. When I was in East Africa, in Nairobi, I would see women going to the pump, the water pump, in the morning, early morning. Why? Because you would never want to go in the heat of the day. Well, the woman is there in the heat of the day because, as we find out from John's gospel, she has been married 5 times and is living with a man who is not her husband. Now here, if anything, is a parallel to the LGBTQ person. This woman is in a irregular sexual relationship. Okay. Now, by rights, there are 3 reasons Jesus should not be speaking to this person. 1, she's an unaccompanied woman. 2, she's a Samaritan. Okay. And as you know, Jews and Samaritans were often at odds mainly because of the place of worship. They felt that God should be worshiped. Jews in the temple in Jerusalem, the Samaritans in Mount Gerizim. Okay. And then finally, because of her irregular situation, woman married 5 times and living with someone who's not her husband. Okay. So all reasons that Jesus should not be talking to her, should probably call her a sinner, if we're looking at, rules and regulations solely. So what does he do? He meets her at the well. He has one of the longest conversations in John's gospel, in the whole gospels, with anyone. A long back and forth, very gentle, very respectful. He says to her, as you remember, right? If I have water that you can drink, you'll never be thirsty. I'm paraphrasing, of course. John is a little more articulate. And she says, misunderstanding, the famous Johannine understanding, you know, give me this water that I might drink it. And he reveals himself to her. I am the living water, one of the great I am statements in John's gospel. He does her a great service because in other parts of John's gospel, he does not reveal himself in that way to everybody. Okay. Then what happens? Then he commissions her to go off and spread the good news to the Samaritans, to her community. She leaves her water jug behind, empty. It's a great symbol. The scripture scholar, the Johannine scholar, Sander Schneiders, says that she sort of parallels Peter, doesn't she? Peter leaves his nets behind, his livelihood. She leaves her valuable water jug behind in order to go and spread the gospel. She's an apostle because apostle means to be sent. So again, the second example, look how Jesus treats someone on the margins who is also in an irregular sexual situation. Does he condemn her? Does he say, I'm not speaking to you? Does he call her a sinner? Does he treat her like dirt? Does he single her out for punishment? Does he make fun of her? No. He treats her with great dignity. He listens to her. He listens to her story. And then he reveals himself to her. I am the living water, to her, to the Samaritan woman, and then commissions her to go to her people and spread the good news. So that's the second example of how Jesus treats people on the margins. The third example, I think, is my favorite, and it's the story of Zacchaeus. And as you know, in Luke's gospel, Jesus is going through Jericho. We just had the gospel story of the healing of Bartimaeus on Sunday, and it's at the same time that he's passing through Jericho. It's at the end of his ministry, which is important. He's on his way to Jerusalem. It's important because he would have been traveling with a big crowd. So it's not just, you know, maybe the 12. It's a big crowd. People would have known him. He would have just healed Bartimaeus, right? Or is about to heal Bartimaeus. He's a big deal. Jericho is a huge town. I've been there a couple times. It's the world's longest continually inhabited town. Okay, so think maybe 20,000 or 30,000 people. Okay, big town. In that town is Zacchaeus. Now, he is described as the chief tax collector. Scripture scholars say that this also meant the chief sinner. Now, what I would like you to do, my brothers and sisters, is to see Zacchaeus as an emblem of the LGBTQ Catholic. I know that might sound strange, but you will see many, many parallels. First of all, Zacchaeus is described in the Gospels as short in stature. Now, of course, Luke means he's physically short, right? But how little stature do LGBTQ people have in our church? How little stature or standing do they have? Not invited to participate in things, singled out, treated like dirt, treated like lepers, very little stature. We're told that Zacchaeus could not see Jesus on account of the crowd. Isn't that great? On account of the crowd. Now, of course, that means in Luke, he's too short and he couldn't see over their heads. How often are we the crowd? How often is the church the crowd that prevents people with little stature from encountering Jesus? How often are we the crowd? How often is the church the reason that LGBT people cannot encounter Jesus? So what does Zacchaeus do? As you know, he climbs the famous sycamore tree. Funny enough, if you go to Jericho today, you'll see there's a tree inevitably called the Zacchaeus tree. Funny enough, the first time I was there with some pilgrims, the pilgrims said, "Is that Zacchaeus's tree, Father Jim? Is that really the tree?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I guess does that look 2,000 years old?" And a friend of mine, another Jesuit who was traveling with me, said, "Well, if it was 2,000 years old in Jesus's day, it would have been this big." So it has to be bigger than that. So who knows? But he does climb a sycamore tree, a wonderful little detail that is in there in Luke's gospel. Why does he do that? He needs to see Jesus. He risks doing something embarrassing or foolish or uncomfortable just to do what everybody else is doing. He has to literally go out on a limb. I'm not sure if that's where the phrase comes from, to see Jesus. Just like LGBTQ people have to do. They have to do a lot more just to be able to encounter Jesus in the church. They have to go to great lengths sometimes, put up with a lot of stuff. So Jesus is coming through Jericho, big crowd. Who does he point to? Does he point to the chief rabbi or some rich person? No, you. Hurry down, I must stay at your house tonight. Zacchaeus comes down. It's a public sign of welcome. It's a public sign of welcome. Zacchaeus comes down with joy. How often are LGBTQ people joyful when they're just welcomed into church? Everybody else sort of takes that for granted, how joyful they are. And then it says a great line, Zacchaeus stathes is the Greek. He stood his ground. Why? There's another sign of the LGBTQ person having to stand their ground. Why? Because my favorite line in this whole story, quote, all who saw it began to grumble. All who saw it began to grumble. An extension of mercy to people on the margins always makes some people furious. You can see that today in the church. All who saw it began to grumble. A New Testament scholar said to me, the Greek is panta, that all means even the disciples. They don't like this. Zacchaeus comes down, and I'll tell you something I just found out this week. You're going to laugh. I've been preaching about this story for the last 3 years. And you're going to say, you're going to say that can't be true. The traditional translation is Zacchaeus has a kind of conversion, as you know, in front of Jesus. And he says, if I have defrauded anyone, I will repay them 4 times over, and I will give half my money to the poor. And so it's a sense of his conversion. That is not the original Greek. And I've looked this up 20 times just to make sure. You can look it up in the Anchor Bible. The original Greek is in the present tense. So he says, if I defraud anyone, I do repay them 4 times over, and I do give half my money to the poor. So in a sense, it's Jesus revealing this man's generosity now. I literally just found out this week. I do give half my money to the poor. So the person who they thought was this terrible person is revealed as generous. The conversion may be the conversion of the crowd, who is able to see this man in a new light. And then Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. It's a beautiful story. And once again, it's a story of welcome. It's a story of welcome. Because for Jesus, it's community first and any conversion second. And it seems to me in this ministry, we can stand in 2 places, can't we, my brothers and sisters? We can stand with the crowd who grumbles, fine. Or we can stand with Jesus, who reaches out. Now, but before I wrap up, I'm very conscious of time. I want to tell you a little bit about how Pope Francis has been trying to put this into action, very briefly. Now, I think many people in this ministry hope for sort of grand statements or grand declarations, and Pope Francis, I think, prefers to go step by step. But I think it's really important to see the kinds of things that he's done. Number one, he's the first person ever to use the word gay, the first pope ever to use the word gay, when he said 5 most famous words of his papacy, who am I to judge? You know, he was talking about gay priests. And then the next day, someone pushed him on it, someone in a press conference, and said, well, you were only talking about gay priests. And he said, no, I was talking about gay everyone. Everyone is gay. Who am I to judge? He has said that a family should never push out their gay children. They should listen to them and accompany them. He has said in Amoris Laetitia, when we think about LGBT people, before all else, we should treat them with respect. Okay. He has gay friends. He told his friend Juan Carlos Cruz, God made you that way, who's an openly gay man. And then he appointed Juan Carlos Cruz, an openly gay man, to a top-level Vatican commission. He sent friendly words to Sister Monica Astorga, who works with transgender people in Argentina. He met with me. He sent a letter, which I was able to publicize, talking about how he prays for our flock, right, with LGBTQ people. He has said God would never say to a homosexual person, get away from me. So in all of these gestures, he has done, and he has supported, as Anne was saying in that movie, Francesco, legal protection for civil unions. Now, a lot of people say, you know, especially in the West, oh, not enough. Well, you know, it's a big step forward, because in some parts of the world, what may seem tepid is really white hot in other parts of the world. Just to say these things and just to acknowledge these people. is a big step forward, particularly when we look, for example, at Pope Emeritus Benedict, who just, a few weeks ago said that, civil unions were a threat to all humanity. So this is a distinct change. He has also put in place many cardinals, archbishops, and bishops who have been very LGBT friendly. Okay. And I think, one of these trends could change. The Pope Francis, we hope not, could, knock wood, die tomorrow. And so that could change. We could have a Pope and cardinals who are not as open. But another trend is not changing, which is that more and more people are coming out and being open about their sexuality and their gender identity. And as more and more people come out in more and more countries, more and more families are affected. And as more and more families are affected, more and more parishes are affected, and orders and schools. And so it's just changing. It's just happening. One small thing I think that's happening is, and I think people probably know it in this group, more and more priests, bishops, religious, deacons, lay leaders have nieces and nephews who are LGBT. That just changes things. So the church is gradually changing, and I think for the better. So it's 9:30, it's 7:39. Those are three things I wanted to discuss. My own personal journey. Sorry for talking so fast. I hope my Philadelphia accent is easy to understand. First, it's my own personal journey. Second, the most important thing I think are those gospel stories and looking at the way Christ encounters people on the margins. And there's no one more marginalized in our church than the LGBT person. And third, a little bit about how Pope Francis is doing it, which is, I would say, step by step with gestures and signs. So there you go. 7:40 my time, 10:40 or 7:40 your time. Happy to have a little bit of Q&A. And as I said, I'm sorry, I may have spoken a little too quickly, but I wanted to get all that in. So thank you very much.
So Jim, thank you. Thank you for sharing yourself and your story, and for the work you've been doing that's brought us here together. Few questions have come in through chat and also to us on the email line. I suppose something that struck me, because I'm in the lucky position to get to ask, I'm going to ask a question that struck me. Your exposition of the gospel stories were clear and simple and easy and make total sense about Jesus going out to the marginalized. My question is, why is it so difficult? Why is this such a difficult thing for the church to not just address as being kind of core to who we are as church and who Jesus is?
Yeah, I think most of it's fear of people who are different as other, fear that somehow this is going to tread on church teaching, fear, mainly, often it's fear of people's own complicated sexuality, right? I think that people are the most, not all the time, but the people that are the most, in my experience, rageful. I mean, you can disagree with this, and I'm not Jesus, I'm not the Pope, but when people are enraged and infuriated, and I've been spat upon, and all these terrible things, protests, there's something going on inside of them, and I think sexuality is a very vulnerable part for us, right? As the New Testament says, perfect love drives out fear. I think perfect fear drives out love. So I think that's what's going on. And it's just difficult. And, look, culturally, there are many places where this is just being talked about. And so the church is, as you know, enculturated, and we can't expect it to be seen in the same way in every country. But I do think the church has a responsibility, particularly to simply protect these people, right? It's all of us. I mean, one of the things I noticed in some of the comments about, talking about they. Well, the point of a lot of those stories is, particularly in terms of Zacchaeus, is Jesus is always moving the disciples out. It's from the inside out. There's no us and them. It's all us. And he brings people from the outside in. So it's all about creating an us, as Francis says, towards an ever wider we.
I think that comment about, we've historically talked about them, whether it's survivors of abuse, them, whereas for so many it's us, and that's so true of this topic as well. The separation between them and us is part, I think, of the challenge. So another question I have is from the chat. So isn't it time the church rethought its teaching on human sexuality?
Okay, well, I am not going to challenge church teaching, but I would say this. I would say that the synod that's happening now is a good time for us to look at all sorts of things that are that need to be looked at in terms of people's experiences. One of the things I always like to say in terms of church teaching on sexuality, and by the way, I would say church teaching on LGBT people is not just those lines in the catechism. People always say, what about church teaching? Church teaching is at heart Jesus. Church teaching is not a book, it's a person, right? And when we think about church teaching on LGBT people, we have to confront these gospel stories, or the story today, the gospel today about the bent over woman. I mean, Jesus, in a sense, breaks a rule in order to help someone flourish, right? We need to look at these gospel stories. That's part of church teaching too. But in terms of some of the lines in the catechism, I always go back to something. This is not made up. It sounds like a perfect anecdote, but it's not made up. A mother came up to me at a talk at a college and said, do people in the church understand what language like intrinsically disordered can do to a 14-year-old boy? She said it could destroy him. So we need to listen to people like that woman and to that 14-year-old boy. We need to listen to their experiences.
And then what? I suppose, I think I think, you know, the comments on chat, the conversation is that there is listening. How, I suppose the question from that is, how then can we practice inclusive ministry in the face of strong internal church opposition, which can sometimes get nasty?
It can. I would say a couple things. Number one, listen to the LGBTQ people. That's the first thing. Listen. Look how Jesus treats the woman at the well. Look what Jesus says Sunday to Bartimaeus. Great thing to ask LGBT people. What do you want me to do for you? So you listen to them. Second, I think it's being friends with them, right? And being friends means celebrating with them and suffering with them when they're suffering. I just did a funeral. I just did a memorial service on Saturday at our main parish in New York City for a gay man named Carlos, who was, get this, in our parish, Eucharistic minister, lector, spiritual director. He was a hospital chaplain at a cancer hospital, and his husband was there. You know, can you be a friend in that way? Can you grieve with them, right? So listen to them like Jesus listened to Bartimaeus, be friends with them. And third, I would say advocate for them. I think, look, you know, I think Anne or whoever asked this question, you know, in the face of opposition, all who saw it began to grumble. Now, if Zacchaeus had waited for everyone in the crowd to approve of what he was doing, he would have never come down from the tree. And if Jesus had waited for everyone to stop grumbling, he would have never called to Zacchaeus, and there would have never been that meeting. And so part of it is, look, I mean, it's Jesus promises us, you know, persecution. And part of it is kind of being willing to take the heat sometimes. You know, you're never uncharitable or mean or anything, and you always, you know, work with people as much as you can. But part of it is being willing to have people grumble. I always think about that image of Jesus. You would imagine if the crowd grumbles and Jesus said, okay, whoa, okay, don't come down. That was stupid of me. You're a terrible person. And notice, I forgot to say this in my exegesis on Zacchaeus. He doesn't say to Zacchaeus, you're a terrible person. You're a sinner. I'm not, you know. No, he says, I'm coming to your house.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jim, for that. Another comment in the chat that you might like to comment on is taking it from the chat. What if we reverse the thinking? What if it's LGBTQIA plus people and others are not the margin, but the center of the message?
I think that's right.
What if the Holy Spirit put us in your midst, right in our families, right in our lives, to teach us the lesson of tolerance and love?
Right. And in a sense, where is Jesus? Where is Jesus? Jesus goes to the margins. And where should the center of the church be? The center of the church should be with Jesus. And it's not just LGBTQ people, it's with refugees, it's with the poor, it's with the sick, right? That is the center. I also think a lot about, so I agree with that. I think it's encouraging people to see that. I also think a lot about the parable of the Good Samaritan. So of course, I mean, I'm not going to repeat it. You know, the traditional take is we should be good Samaritans, just true. We should help person. And you could say that the LGBTQ person is the person by the side of the road who is literally beaten sometimes. And do we pass by? And I think the church often is passing by. I mean, the church cannot even get itself to oppose violence against LGBTQ people. I mean, even that's too far for the church, right? So we pass by. But I think in terms of flipping it around, as your questioner says, remember that the beaten man's salvation depends on the person he considers the other. So for the beaten man, the Samaritan is the other. He's different. He's hated. And yet his salvation depends on that man. And so I think the church's salvation depends on, and our salvation depends on, these people who we consider marginalized, but as you say, are really in the center.
Why do you think in this time that this topic has is having a voice? I mean, there are other marginalized groups.
Sure.
You'd argue women in the church.
Yeah.
There's a whole list, but it feels like there's definitely a reawakening or an opportunity to have these conversations, an openness to this.
Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, in general, I think that because it is being more widely discussed in many countries, even 15, I always say that this is the difference for me. 15 years ago, when I would be at a talk, a mother or a father would come up and say, my son is gay. Now they come up and they say, my son is gay. Mm-hmm. That's the difference. And so I think with a greater acceptance in families, there's a greater desire for those in those families for acceptance of their children, especially, and their brothers and sisters in the church. So what was before thought of as, there's no way I could even ask for that. I'm even too embarrassed to be who I am. I'm embarrassed to say that my son or my daughter is LGBT. Now there's an assumption, I think, because it has moved ahead in society. But I would also say, and to your point, there are many people who are marginalized, and I would think women is one important group. And yet, in the Vatican, they will say publicly, we want more leadership roles for women. We want to have International Women's Day. We want to support women in this way. Now, presenting the question of ordination, which is an important question, there is at least this desire and this sort of public statement about women. There's nothing like that for LGBT people. There's no Vatican Commission on LGBTQ people. There's no Vatican person saying we need more gay this or there's just not. And even as far as Pope Francis has gone, which is, I think we should be very grateful for, there is nothing like that. And so they really are treated like dirt. They still are the lepers in the church. And you can just ask this person who I talked to today who was fired from his job.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just looking through the chat. Just trying to read
I'm looking through. I'm
just reading a few things at once. So one comment is, I'll read it. As a Muslim, I think, and I'm sure everyone's reading it, but as a Muslim, I think the same issues as you on many issues. Religious people should continue in the boundaries of both respect and love in their social relations with LGBT. My question is whether we should make a distinction between the idea of homosexuality and homosexual persons. While maximizing our good human relations with homosexuals as believers, shouldn't something be done to combat the idea of homosexuality and its dissemination that problematized all the divine books? I believe in the futility of any detective measure other than the civilized spiritual way of persuasion. In the most conservative Islamic countries, homosexuality is a rising trend. I personally think that neither only Christians nor Muslims alone will be successful in this matter. Collaboration is needed. Do you have any comment, Jim?
Well, I would say that the more that we can understand, if I understand the question, the more that we can understand the roots of homosexuality and the roots of, all sorts of things, especially the leading edge would be, the transgender experience, which I think we're just learning about, right? Where I think that the church needs to listen. The more that we can trust science and psychologists and psychiatrists, for example, in terms of homosexuality, people say that they are just born that way. Okay. And so to blame them or to think it's an addiction or something like that is simply going against science. I would say, the fellow who mentioned in the different Muslim countries, it brought something to mind. I do think that in some countries, where it is, and this is sort of jumping off on the question a little bit, where it is illegal or a capital offense, the church should easily be able to stand up against that. And yet the church hasn't. And in some places, the bishops even side with these repressive laws. They support these laws that it should be criminalized. That leads to people being beaten and abused and harassed. It's just unbelievable. So I think there's three things that the church could easily oppose. And I've talked about this with different cardinals and bishops and whatnot, that would not challenge any church teaching. Number one, the church should oppose the criminalization of homosexuality. I mean, that's a very easy thing to oppose. Number two, it should oppose conversion therapy, which is extremely dangerous. And number three, it should oppose violence against LGBTQ people. Now, those seem like pretty easy things to do, and yet they're very hard. It's very hard to get people to even say yes to that. So I think again about this Good Samaritan. I think we're walking on by. It's like, help me, help me. Raise your voice and say I shouldn't be beaten. No, we can't do that. So it's pretty, to me, it's pretty glaring.
So, Jim, on that note, we have probably, unfortunately, reached our time. But I think that is a really important note to finish on because, again, it's a call to action, isn't it? So it's a call to bigger action, wider action within the church, but then everything you've been talking about is a call to action as we meet each other, wherever we meet each other and encounter each other. So I am very grateful that when I rang you, not expecting to even be able to get through to you, you immediately said yes to joining us. I want to thank everyone who has joined also in this chat. We will take down the comments and we'll have a think about what we can do, what we should do with what you've shared with us today. It's a big issue for a lot of people, for themselves, for the church, for their families. It's going to take prayer and action. So before I hand over to Peter to close this event, I do wish to bring to your attention that Jim is preparing, and Jim, you might want to just speak to that briefly just before we let you go about your documentary, because we will send with the link after this.
Oh, yeah.
We'll send a link to Jim's documentary that he's preparing on this topic that you might want to consider.
Yeah, well, I'll say three things very briefly. One, I thought you were going to say, actually, tomorrow I'm having some surgery. I would really appreciate, it's minor. I'd really appreciate your prayers. That would be really great. That's what I really want to say. It's minor, but two, as Anne was saying, there's a documentary that is called Building a Bridge that came out as a film, and that's at some point is going to be purchased by, like Netflix or Amazon or something. So keep your eyes peeled for that. It's called Building a Bridge. But I think the thing that I really want you to know about is this website, which we're going to be starting soon in a couple of months. I got a grant to, it's like a resources for LGBTQ Catholic ministry. I'm not even sure what it's going to be called, but if you follow me on social media, you won't miss it. But and also, I want to say before we end, thank you very much. Thank you for your great work, and please do keep me in your prayers.
We will indeed, Jim. And we're all very grateful for the openness with which you'll have these conversations and the work you're doing. So, and God bless for tomorrow surgery. Peter, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Anne. I've read in the chat already expressions of gratitude to Jim for his time with us today. So I know that the participants here have really appreciated the opportunity to have this time. Pope Francis reminds us constantly, we are all sisters and brothers, and he encourages us to dialogue, to listening, and to encounter. And I think what Jim has suggested, that we speak, we engage with our sisters and brothers from the, however you want to term it, the LGBTQI plus, or the rainbow family, whatever the appropriate terminology is. But it is so important that we continue to be open and inclusive to all those people of faith, because there are many in our church, but also those who are not. And so to have that engagement continually. So I really want to thank Jim, not just for today's session, but also for his leadership of this issue, because it comes at a cost. As he said today, there are people who whinge and whine, you know, and complain about people who speak truth. So I want to thank you for that and for being a wonderful spokesperson for the church in this particular area that a lot of people shy away from. I'd also like to thank Anne for her wonderful facilitation today, for drawing us together, posing the questions, and behind the scenes to Sylvia and to Emma for all the background work that's gone on for this today. So we might put our hands together for our organisers virtually or whatever.
All of you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to James, but of course also to the, you know, the well over 100, 200, I'm not sure what the figures are, but for all of you for being here, because obviously you don't speak, you know, to empty rooms, and it's wonderful to have people here engaging, and people were very engaged, the chat was alive, there was conversation going on, people were responding to what Jim said. So to all of the participants, thank you very much. God bless, and we'll see you at another event. Thank you to Jim. Good luck tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good and good morning to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks, Peter.
Bye now. Bye-bye.